today's mindful moment. Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Get ready for some shocking truths about biodiversity. We're going way back to 1992 with E.O. Wilson's The Diversity of Life. It might seem like a while ago, but trust me, his insights are more relevant now in 2025 than ever. And to help us break it all down, we've got our amazing expert here with us.
It's wild how Wilson was already sounding the alarm bells back then. His work really makes you think about our impact on the planet.
For sure. And before we get too deep, can I just say, Wilson's writing is so captivating.
Yeah.
He drops you right into the Amazon at night. You can practically feel the humidity, hear all the crazy sounds. He even talks about this intense thunderstorm during his research. Real raw power. And then there's this story about bugs trapped in amber for millions of years.
Yeah.
Like a little window into evolution.
He's a master storyteller for sure.
Yeah.
And a brilliant scientist. Makes you want to keep reading to solve the mysteries.
Okay, so let's unpack this biodiversity thing. Most people think it's just counting species, but there's so much more to it, right?
You got it. It's the variety of life at all levels, from teeny tiny genes to whole ecosystems. And we got to understand how tricky it is to even define a species. Wilson talks about the biological species concept, like if creatures can breed, they're the same species, right?
Seems simple enough.
But then he brings up the phylogenetic species concept, which looks at their ancestry and genes.
So, two critters could look alike, even make babies, but their evolutionary history says they're different. Whoa, that's trippy.
It is, and it shows that life is even more interconnected and diverse than we think.
Like there's a whole hidden world beneath the surface. And speaking of hidden worlds, the sheer scale of biodiversity is mind-blowing. We've only named something like 1.4 million species, but scientists think there could be 10, maybe even 100 million out there.
Crazy, right? Wilson mentions those wild bug bomb studies by Terry Irwin. He fogged whole trees to catch insects. His research suggested 30 million insect species in tropical forests alone.
Hold up. 30 million? Just insects, just in tropical forests.
Yep. Later research, which Wilson also talks about, adjusted that number a bit, but it still shows how much we don't know, especially in those important ecosystems.
Makes you realize how much we still got to learn. So all this diversity, how does it even happen? Is it just gradual change over time?
It's not just gradual change, no. Wilson focuses on speciation, where lineages split and bam, new species. He uses this cool blue butterfly example. It evolves into two separate species when a habitat gets divided, like by a river.
Makes sense. If they're oscillated, they adapt and become distinct over time, right?
Yeah.
But are there other ways new species pop up?
Absolutely. There's this thing called polyploidy. Basically, the chromosomes double or triple. It can create a brand new species in a single generation.
That's evolution on fast forward.
It shows how dynamic life is, always adapting. But creation is balanced by destruction, right? Wilson lays out 5 major extinction events that have already reshaped life on Earth.
And now we're living through the 6th, driven by us. This one could be faster and more devastating than any before. Feels like a crucial moment for the planet.
It is, and it makes you think about who we focus on when we talk about extinction. We tend to worry about the big, charismatic animals. But what about the little guys? Do they matter?
That's a good point. It's easy to forget about them.
They're essential. Wilson argues that even the tiniest organisms are vital for a healthy planet. Studies, some referenced in the book, show that diverse ecosystems are more productive. They're better at cleaning our air and water, giving us food, even regulating the climate.
So biodiversity is literally tied to human survival. We don't always see that connection.
Exactly. And he uses this tree trunk microcosm example. It shows how one tree can support a crazy diverse ecosystem. Lichens, mosses, bugs, even the microscopic stuff in the soil.
It's like a secret world teeming with life. And what about all the bacteria and microorganisms, the stuff we can't even see?
That's a whole other world. Wilson calls it a taxonomic black hole, a massive unexplored frontier of biodiversity.
So much to learn. Sadly, all this amazing diversity is under threat. Like a beautiful tapestry unraveling and we're pulling the threads. What are the biggest dangers?
Wilson uses the canary in the coal mine analogy. These extinctions are warning signs for the planet's health. There are so many factors at play. Habitat loss is a huge one. Like deforestation, he even gives this stark rule of thumb. Losing 90% of a habitat can wipe out half the species.
That's scary. Shows how connected it all is, how much our actions matter.
For sure. Then you've got overharvesting, like what happened to sea otters. And invasive species disrupting entire ecosystems. The Nile perch in Lake Victoria is a classic example.
It's like a domino effect. One change triggers others.
Right, and while we focus on the big animals, Wilson reminds us we're losing tons of species we might not even notice. He calls them centennial extinctions.
The specialized species, the ones with very specific needs.
They're often the first to go, and their loss can have ripple effects we don't even see.
Okay, let's get specific. What are some examples from the book that really illustrate all this? The Hawaiian honeycreepers really fascinated me.
They're a perfect example of adaptive radiation. One ancestor evolves into many different forms to fill all these ecological niches, but they're also super vulnerable to human impact, especially on islands.
It's like a microcosm of the bigger issue. Unique species evolving in isolation, then boom, threats they can't handle.
Then there's the Great American Interchange, when North and South America connected millions of years ago. This massive exchange of species shows how competition and extinction play out on a huge scale.
Two worlds colliding.
Makes you wonder how it shaped the biodiversity we see today.
Another one that stuck with me was the Manos Forest experiment. Wilson describes how even subtle habitat changes can have huge effects.
Yeah, that one was groundbreaking. It showed how some species can handle smaller forest patches, but others, like the Saki monkey, can't adapt.
It's happening everywhere. Forests are cleared for agriculture, roads, development.
A microcosm of the bigger problem.
And then there's the sad story of the Trilepidea adamsi mistletoe in New Zealand. It went extinct because of us. Habitat loss, overcollecting, even the decline of birds that helped it spread.
It's a reminder that even small actions can have big consequences, especially in delicate ecosystems.
These examples are powerful. They show how interconnected life is, but it's not all doom and gloom, right? What can we actually do?
You're right, there's hope. Wilson offers some solutions. He talks about sustainable development, using resources without destroying them, like harvesting things like fruits, nuts, and latex from forests.
Working with nature, not against it. Are there other ways to do that?
Absolutely. He highlights ex situ conservation. Things like zoos, seed banks, and botanical gardens. They're like temporary shelters for species while we fix the bigger problem.
Safety net while we restore habitat.
Exactly. And protected areas are crucial, national parks and reserves. But Wilson says we need to expand them strategically. He even mentions debt for nature swaps. Countries get debt relief in exchange for conservation commitments.
That's creative, using economics for good. He also talks about getting local communities involved.
Yes. Especially indigenous peoples, they have so much knowledge, they live in these areas, they rely on them, they have a real interest in protecting them.
This has been so insightful, we've barely scratched the surface. What's the main takeaway for our listeners so far?
I think it's this. Biodiversity loss isn't just a scientific problem, it's a human problem. It affects us all.
We're not separate from nature, we're part of this web of life.
And everything we do impacts that web.
Let's pause here for now. We've covered defining biodiversity, the threats, and some solutions. But there's so much more to discover.
We've only just started to explore this incredible web of life.
Join us for part 2 of our deep dive into the shocking truths about biodiversity. We'll keep unraveling this fascinating topic and discuss what we can do to protect it.
We'll have more captivating examples and insights from E.O. Wilson's The Diversity of Life.
Until then, stay curious and stay tuned. Wow, it's incredible to think about all that life we haven't even discovered yet.
It really makes you feel small, doesn't it? Makes you realize how important it is to understand how it's all connected.
Wilson says that's what makes biodiversity so tough, so resilient. He talks about how diverse ecosystems can handle stress better, bounce back from disturbances.
He compares it to a tapestry. You start pulling out threads. Eventually, the whole thing unravels, lose enough species, and the system crashes.
That's a powerful image. It shows why we need to protect whole ecosystems, not just individual species.
Exactly. And some species play bigger roles than others, what Wilson calls keystone species. He gives some fascinating examples.
The one about the sea otter really stuck with me. They were hunted almost to extinction for their fur. But then things got really messed up without them.
It's a classic trophic cascade. No sea otters meant sea urchins went wild, and they devoured all the kelp.
Wow. So losing one species could have a huge impact.
Kelp forests are crucial. They're home to all sorts of creatures. They protect coastlines. They even absorb carbon dioxide.
It's like a chain reaction. Everything is connected.
Luckily, sea otters are making a comeback in some areas, but it's a cautionary tale. Shows how we can disrupt the balance.
Another keystone species Wilson talks about is the elephant. I knew they were amazing, but I didn't realize how important they are.
They're ecosystem engineers, literally shaping the landscape. They clear out forests, dig water holes, even spread seeds with their dung.
Wow, they have a huge impact on the African savanna.
Without them, it would look totally different. They create a variety of habitats.
Makes you think every species has a role to play. Speaking of smaller creatures, what about those driver ants Wilson mentions?
Ah, yes, those massive swarms. They might seem scary, but they're important.
When I read about them, I have to admit I was a little freaked out.
It might look chaotic, but they help keep things in check. By preying on other insects, they prevent any one species from taking over.
So even creatures that seem harmful can be vital for balance.
Exactly, and it goes beyond predator-prey relationships. Wilson also talks about symbiosis, the relationships between different species.
He mentions parasitism, where one benefits at the expense of another, but also commensalism, where one benefits without harming the other.
And then there's mutualism, where both benefit, a win-win. It's super important for land ecosystems.
Like those mycorrhizal fungi that live with plant roots.
Right. They've been doing that for millions of years. The fungi help plants get nutrients, and the plants give them carbohydrates.
Mind-blowing, these complex interactions that have shaped life.
And we're learning more all the time. Wilson talks about how DNA analysis has changed the game.
It's like looking into the past, tracing evolutionary relationships.
And we're finding new species all the time. It's exciting.
But also urgent, right? We're discovering all this diversity as we're losing it.
That's the tough part. The more we learn, the more we realize what's at stake. Wilson argues we're in a sixth extinction caused by us.
He doesn't sugarcoat it. Deforestation, overfishing, pollution, climate change.
It's a lot, but I think it's important to remember that we can make a difference.
He also mentions those sentineling extinctions, losing specialized species without even knowing it.
It shows how much we still don't know and how much we're losing.
And it's not just about saving pretty animals. Biodiversity gives us so much.
Clean air, water, food, medicine, even inspiration.
So it's not just an environmental issue, it affects everyone.
Absolutely. And it's not just about us, it's about recognizing the value of all life.
It's about ensuring future generations can experience a diverse world.
It's understanding that we're all connected.
This has been a profound exploration so far. The challenges are real, but I'm feeling a bit of hope too.
I agree. Wilson stays optimistic. He thinks we can turn things around. But it'll take all of us and a change in how we see things.
I think that's a perfect segue to our final part. We've talked about the problems and some solutions, but what does a better future look like?
That's what we'll explore in our last segment. We'll look at some inspiring success stories and discuss what the future holds for life on Earth.
We've been on quite a journey with these shocking truths about biodiversity.
A real deep dive.
And we've talked about the problems, but there are amazing conservation success stories out there.
Absolutely. Easy to get caught up in the bad news. Even Wilson, he's realistic about the crisis, but he still believes we can make a difference.
And there are so many people working hard to protect biodiversity.
One of the best things we've done is setting up protected areas.
Wilson talks about how important national parks and reserves have been. They've saved habitats and species.
Like Guanacaste National Park in Costa Rica, they're letting the forest regrow on old cattle ranches.
Wow, working with nature. Are there other examples like that?
Tons. It's not just about drawing lines on a map. You got to get local communities involved, make it worthwhile for them to protect nature.
He mentions the rubber tappers in the Amazon. They've been sustainably harvesting for ages.
They rely on the forest, so they protect it.
It's a win-win, and there are so many community efforts like that around the world.
It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Wilson also talks about those ex situ efforts, zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks. They're vital for species that are struggling in the wild.
A safety net. Plus, they help us learn more about these species.
They're like living classrooms, raising awareness about conservation.
He talks about the International Species Inventory System. It coordinates breeding and conservation programs globally.
And there have been some amazing comebacks. Species like the Arabian oryx, the black-footed ferret, the golden lion tamarin.
It shows what we can do when we work together.
These are great, but there's still a long way to go. Wilson argues we need to change how we think about nature.
He says we need to go beyond just seeing it for what we can get from it. Recognize that all species have a right to exist.
We're part of nature, not separate from it.
We're all connected.
I think that's Wilson's key message.
Yeah.
It's a call to action, to reconnect with nature, appreciate it, and protect it.
It's about saving ourselves, really. Our fate is tied to all living things.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much.
The good, the bad, and the hopeful.
We've learned, explored, and celebrated. But now it's up to us. What kind of future do we want?
If you're ready to learn more, check out E.O. Wilson's The Diversity of Life.
It's a must-read, and we've got more resources in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into biodiversity. Remember, read, subscribe, share, purchase. Let's keep this conversation going and work towards a future where everyone thrives.
There's a link to buy the book in the episode description.